Hey everyone, I'm Kumar Dhanagopal. I work for Google in the Bay Area as a staff technical writer. I've been in the technical writing profession for a little more than 2 decades now. Over the past several years, I've been doing some research into web analytics to learn how analytics can help us understand our users better and how we can use analytics to demonstrate the business impact of the work that we do as technical writers. In this talk, we will discuss how web analytics can help us as technical writers, understand a few of the key metrics, look at the typical analytics process, and learn how to interpret metrics to get reliable insights into our users' needs and behaviors. A couple of disclaimers first. The views and the opinions that I'm going to share today in this talk are my own. They might not reflect the views of my employer. Also, this talk is not about specific analytics tools offered by different vendors like Adobe or Google. I'd like to start with a quick look at how analytics can help us as technical writers. Web analytics can help us learn who our users are, where they're from, how they use the information we publish, and so on. Analytics is a relatively low cost and reasonably practical alternative to engaging live with our customers. Analytics can tell us which pages our users visit most often, how much time they spend reading our content, and how they navigate our help system. We can use this information to improve the quality of the decisions that we make when we plan, write, and maintain documentation. But analytics cannot provide all the answers that we need. Analytics cannot give us information about user sentiment, for example. Analytics metrics will not help us understand our users' intents and their experiences when using our content. What information were they looking for? Were they satisfied or frustrated? Did they skim content or read through it carefully? And so on. For the answers to these questions, we might need to use other sources of feedback like user ratings and comments. Even those sources might not help us fully understand user sentiment, but that's a topic for another day. Before we dive into analytics, I'd like to pause a little and let us take a look at this graph. As you can tell, this is an absolutely ridiculous graph. It shows an almost direct correlation between two phenomena that are not related in any way. The point of this graph is that data can be manipulated. Data can be used to show something that's entirely fictional as a truth. We all understand that correlation does not necessarily mean causation. I'd like us to keep this pitfall in mind every time we use analytics in our work. But then, what answers can analytics metrics provide? Before we look at specific metrics, I want to make sure that we all fully understand the meaning of a few key metrics. Imagine for a moment that this figure is a website with 8 pages, A, B, C, and so on, with a landing page named G. Let's say that a user enters this website at page F and then moves through a few other pages. At one point, the user returns to page F and then leaves the site through page G. In other words, after going to page G, this user closes the browser session or goes to a different website. Another user comes to our website through page C, clicks through a few pages, and then leaves the website from page H. And a third user enters the website through page E and then exits the website from the same page without navigating to any other page. So that's the scenario. Here's how the metrics for these three user sessions would be measured. Let's start with page F. Page F was viewed twice during session 1. Note that I said it was viewed, not visited. It was viewed once as the entry page and a second time on the way out. But because both the views were during the same session, only one visit was counted. It's also counted as an entry page. Let's look at page E now. Page E has one instance of every metric type, including a bounce. A bounce happens when a visitor enters a website through a page and then exits the website directly from that page without going to any other page. The calculation so far is simple, but in real life, things get a little more complicated. For example, if a user exits our website and then returns within a certain predefined period, then that second visit might actually not be counted as a separate visit. Also, if a user enters our website and stays in it for more than a certain period, then the analytics tracker could terminate the visit at the end of that predefined period. These visit limits and timeout settings might seem arbitrary, and they might be different for each analytics tool, but these limits exist for a good reason. They make sure that frequent exits and entries and also delayed exits do not skew the visit related metrics too much. We should also keep in mind that visit tracking is typically done using cookies that the analytics tool sends to the user's browsers. So, for users who don't accept cookies or who delete cookies, the visit related metrics like visit count, visitor count, and the time spent per visit are only partially reliable. We did not talk about the time spent on page metric in this example. We'll cover that a little later. Okay, so we now understand how analytics metrics are collected. How can we use this data? The analytics process has several steps. We don't have time today to discuss the details of each step, but let's go over them quickly. The first step is to define the problem. We all know that a well-defined problem is half the job done. Before we set out to use analytics data, we should find out the business goal or problem that we're trying to solve. As data analysts, we play a role that's similar to that of a medical doctor. Before making any prescription, we should assess the symptoms and then diagnose the problem. The next step is to get the required analytics data. Extracting usable data from analytics tools is not a trivial task. This can be a time-consuming step. We need to know what metrics are tracked. We need a solid understanding of how each metric is measured. We should make sure that the data we're going to analyze is for the right period and that it represents our customer base. Next, we should prepare the data for analysis. Any raw data set is bound to have unique and different problems. We should carefully scrub the data set for any data that's not directly relevant to the problem that we want to solve. This is important to avoid the garbage in, garbage out risk. We need to set aside time to prepare the data for analysis. We should also identify and fix any inconsistencies in the data. For example, metrics might be missing for some periods or for some pages because the analytics server was down or because the instrumentation was not set up correctly. Sometimes we might need to aggregate related data. For example, a page might be served through multiple URLs. We need to aggregate the data for all the related URL variants. The next step is to analyze, explore, and visualize the data. There's really no fixed roadmap for this step in the analytics process. What we do would depend on our goal, our domain knowledge, and the quantity and the quality of the data from the previous step. The step can be a fascinating exercise or an extremely frustrating rabbit hole, or both. The big caveat here is that if we try hard enough, we can tease out literally any insight from any given data. So let's be extremely careful about going too far with interpreting analytics metrics. The final step in the process is to describe and diagnose user behavior, prescribe changes, and predict the effect of those changes. Descriptive analytics describe the key features of a given data set. We look for answers to questions like, what are my top 5 popular pages? In diagnostic analytics, we find out why data is the way it is. So we seek answers to questions like, pages that we think are extremely important are getting relatively low page views. Why is that? And is this even a problem? Prescriptive analytics indicate what we can or should do in the future to get better results for the key metrics that we identify. And predictive analytics involves predicting or projecting future events based on current and historical analytics data. Each time we examine analytics data, we might run into roadblocks. Sometimes we might need to retrace our steps in the process. Almost always, in order to get meaningful insights, we should be prepared to invest considerable effort, be patient, and be prepared for dead ends. I'll spend the next few minutes going over some guidelines to help us interpret analytics metrics. There's a lot of literature about how to use metrics such as visits, page views, time spent, and bounce rate to assess the usage of content in general. I'd like to share a few tips and recommendations that are specific to our domain, that is, technical documentation. The first recommendation is to validate data. We should try to validate our findings and analysis with other data points, including qualitative input. Let's not rely exclusively on any single metric. Another recommendation is to avoid cross-product comparisons. It can be very tempting for us to compare metrics across two or more documentation sets. But as far as possible, we should restrict any comparison to within a product area. Each product is unique, as you all know, in terms of complexity, in terms of the target audience, maturity in the market, customer base, usability, and many other factors. All of these factors affect how our users consume the information that we publish. When analyzing data, we should focus on trends and relative ranking, and never on the absolute metrics for a given document or for a period. Let's look at an example. Over the past 6 months, our users viewed page A and page B approximately the same number of times. So the two pages appear to be equally popular. But the month-wise trend reveals a different story. The page views for page A are on a declining trend overall. The page views for page B show a significant upward trend. But we did not get this insight when we were looking at just the total number of page views. There are a couple of other messages for us from this example. First, the metrics for page B in this example show that we should wait for metrics to mature and become meaningful. In other words, we should avoid looking at metrics until the docs have been in the field for at least a few months. Second, as far as possible, we should use visuals where possible to tease out trends and stories. A graph of this data would have revealed more readily to us the true nature of the differences in usage between these two example pages. The next tip I'd like to offer is that we should remember that offline and second-hand usage are not tracked. For example, if we offer our users the option of downloading PDFs of our documentation, then many of our users might download the PDFs and look up the downloaded file whenever they need help. And there's no way to use web analytics to track this type of content usage. We should keep in mind that users in some environments work within firewalled networks, which means they cannot access online content. Also, secondhand usage is not tracked. Let me explain this. Say a user has a problem when using a product. The user might call up the help desk, or contact a colleague, or post a question on a discussion forum. The person answering the question might look up our content and then provide an answer. Sometimes the person providing the answer can take our content, add some context to it based on specific issues that the user is facing, and might end up publishing a blog. Or they might copy and paste the content into a separate knowledge base that they maintain for themselves or for their team. Over time, as more users look for the same information, users may start referring more often to these secondary or adapted sources of information. And we, as technical writers, would never know that some users benefited indirectly from our content. This is similar to the circulation versus readership issue in the newspaper publishing industry. So let's not make the mistake of assuming that a page with low page views, for example, is not popular because it might have secondary usage that we're not aware of. Interestingly, metrics also depend on the nature of our content. How we organize and publish our content can have a significant effect on the analytics metrics. Let's look at an example for this. Say we have two documents in a doc set, and both documents are similar in terms of content type and length. The first document has 50,000 page views, and the second document in this example has 100,000 page views. It might seem from this data that the second document is more popular significantly. But let's break down the metrics for each document a little. We see now that the first document actually has two HTML pages. We were looking at the aggregate metrics, and each of these pages has 25,000 page views. The second document has four HTML pages. Each of these has again 25,000 page views, aggregated to 100,000. Assuming that both the documents in this example have the same coverage, depth, and breadth in terms of the topics they discuss, it's clear from this example that the web analytics metrics can sometimes paint a misleading picture about how our documents were used. In reality, every page in this example had the same number of effective page views. But because one of the documents was chunked more granularly, it appears to be more popular. Finally, we should always use analytics metrics as supplementary input and not as the primary or the only basis for decision making. We should definitely consider qualitative factors as well. Analytics data can tell us how our users interact with our documentation. But as we discussed earlier, analytics data might not tell us what our users really need or how they feel about the experience of consuming our information. So those were a few general guidelines for analyzing metrics. Next, let's look at some guidelines for interpreting a few specific metrics. Let's start with the page views metric. It's definitely good to see high page views for our pages, and that's a sign that the pages might be popular, though we still can't say for sure whether our users were satisfied with the content. I want to focus here on how we should treat pages that have relatively low page views. First, let's not jump to the conclusion that pages with low page views are not popular. There might be several reasons for low page views. Remember the example from the previous slide? We should look at the trends of page views instead of just the absolute count for a given period. Another thing we should do is we should consider the age of the page. Perhaps the page is relatively new and the product or feature has not been widely adopted yet. The customer base may be low for this product, so we need to wait a bit longer before looking at the metrics for such pages. Another factor is the discoverability of the page. The page might not be showing up in the top search results because it hasn't been optimized for search or we haven't socialized it enough. Another factor to consider is structural changes. Let's say we redesigned the directory structure of our documentation site. That is, we moved some pages to different directories, we removed a few pages, and we renamed some pages. The analytics report might show multiple records for some pages, each with a low page view count. We'll need to manually identify and combine the metrics for all such pages to see the real metrics after accounting for the structural changes in the content. While analyzing pages with low page views, we should also be aware of pages with zero page views. These pages will not show up in the analytics reports. We should check whether these pages are instrumented for analytics tracking first. Also, like for pages with low page views, we should consider the age of the page, the newness of the product or the feature, and whether the page is discoverable. Next, let's look at bounce rates. A bounce occurs when someone enters a website through a page and then leaves the website without viewing any other page in the website. Bounce rate is possibly the most misunderstood or least understood of metrics. First, let's not panic when we see a high bounce rate for a page. It's not a definitive signal for anything. It's definitely not a sign of failure or that the page is critically flawed in some way. Much of the textbook guidance regarding bounce rates is oriented towards e commerce websites. In the online shopping world, a high bounce rate is definitely not a good thing. Online retailers don't want to see users leaving their websites. But for documentation sites, the bounce rate holds somewhat different significance. A high bounce rate for a particular content page could mean that most visitors actually found what they wanted, and so they left our website. But a high bounce rate for a landing page or an orientation page might not be a good symptom. Please remember that if a user's browser session times out, that kind of an exit might be counted as a bounce. For example, if a user enters the website through a page but doesn't ever close the browser, the user's session would time out at some point and the exit would be counted as a bounce. Given these caveats around bounce rates, when we analyze this metric, we should combine the analysis with other metrics, like time spent on page. Let's move on to that metric now. The time spent metric is tricky as well. Does more time spent on a page mean that the content was useful, or that the content was difficult to understand, or that the user simply forgot to close the browser, or something else? I'll share a few examples of how we could interpret this metric. If a page is very popular, that is, page view count is high, and users are spending a lot of time on it, then maybe it has too much content. Perhaps it's chunked at a level that's too high. Consider chunking the content at a more granular level, or perhaps the content is very complex and needs to be simplified. If a page has high bounce rate and users are spending a lot of time on it, then we need to check whether the page is a content page or a landing page. If the page happens to be a landing page, then this combination of high bounce rate and high time spent could indicate that users are desperately looking for some information, and so they're spending a lot of time looking for it in the landing page, but they're not finding what they need. So they're exiting the website to seek answers elsewhere. If the page is a content page, then the combination of high bounce rate and high time spent could indicate that users found what they needed and so they exited the website. But they probably had to digest a lot of information before they found what they wanted. We should explore opportunities to improve the chunking of such content and also look for ways to make such content simpler. For a page that contains reference type information, a short time spent on page could be a good signal. It might indicate that users found what they needed quickly. For example, they might have looked for the description of a specific API field or an example. They possibly found that information and then moved on. But for a page that offers overview or conceptual information, a longer time spent on page might be a positive signal. It might indicate that users spent some time reading the page and possibly found the information useful. When we think of the time spent metric, a quirk of analytics that we should all note is that time spent is typically not calculated for the last page that a user visits before exiting a website. That's because the analytics tools, most of them, typically do not record the timestamp when users exit a website. Consider this example. Say 50 users enter a website through a page. They spend 10 minutes on an average reading the page, and then they exit the site. Another 50 readers come to the page from other pages on the same site. They spend 5 minutes reading the page, and then they move on to other pages within the site. In this scenario, the average time on the page would actually be calculated as 250 divided by 100, which is 2.5 minutes. So only the time spent by the second set of readers, that is, the readers who moved on to other pages within the website and did not exit the website, is considered for calculating the average time spent. In reality, the average actual time spent on the page was 750 divided by 100, which is 7.5 minutes. That's 3 times the reported number. So if we have a page that intentionally leads users to another website, for example, a landing page that lets users download a white paper by going to a third-party content delivery site. Now, this page will necessarily show a very low time spent and a high bounce rate, but that's not a problem, right? So we need to understand the behavior of the page that we're designing. We've now looked at some practical tips to help us interpret web analytics metrics for documentation pages. Before winding up, I'd like to spend a few seconds talking about setting targets for analytics metrics. Many organizations define and track what they call key performance indicators or KPIs for their content. Such targets make sense for certain websites, for example, for content marketing sites, news sites, and online shopping portals. But for technical documentation sites, these KPIs might not make a lot of sense. Instead, we should use analytics to understand how our users consume the information that we deliver, and then we should use that understanding to make decisions about how we plan, prioritize, and staff our projects, or use this data to solve specific business problems. If we decide to set targets for analytics metrics for documentation, then we should consider a couple of important factors to make sure that we set meaningful and measurable targets. These factors include the availability of reliable data and whether the organization has a history and a culture of making decisions based on data. So this brings me to nearly the end of my talk. Let's recap quickly what we covered. Data and reality can be very different. We understood that. Data analysis requires considerable time and effort. Metrics might not give us all the answers to all our questions. To make meaningful decisions, we need to use qualitative data, our judgment, our experience, our knowledge of our docs, and our knowledge of our users' needs based on direct engagements with them. We need to remember that we're trying to solve a business problem first. analytics is merely a means to that end. The deeper we analyze something, the greater the risk that we'll get sucked into the vortex of what I would call analysis paralysis. We need to be aware of this risk and keep our business goals in sight at all times. And when we set out to analyze web metrics, we should constantly remind ourselves to see both the forest and the trees. Analytics is a great resource when we use it wisely. Let's not fall into the trap of using analytics in isolation or as the main data source for measuring our success as technical writers. If you're interested in learning more about web analytics, I'd like to suggest a few interesting books. Thank you so much for all your time. I hope you found this session useful. I'd like to stay engaged with you all to learn more about analytics. If you have any questions or would like to discuss related topics further, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I hope you all have a great day and enjoy the remainder of the conference. Thank you.
I know I have a
Bye.
list of the questions, but I know that you said in the chat that you'd also made a note of them. Are there any in particular that you want to talk about? I'm happy to give you control over which questions you get to answer.
Sure. There was one question, I forget who asked. There was one question early on in the session about if we were to start our analytics strategy from scratch, what are the top things we would
Yeah, that was
choose?
Swapnil. Great question.
Right. So that's an awesome question. And like with any good question, I think the answer is it depends on several factors. But in this case, I think it depends on. I would start with the business problem that we're trying to solve, right, or the business question that we're trying to answer. So I have to constantly remind myself when I take off my tech writer hat and wear my data analyst hat. I need to remind myself constantly that not everything that matters can be measured, and some things that do matter cannot be measured. Right. So I keep that reminder in my mind, and I have to also tell myself that I should be prepared for surprises. I might start out with a hypothesis that I'm trying to prove using numbers, but I should be prepared to back off and say that maybe numbers are not going to give me the answers that I want. Right. So, for example, let's say I'm a writer in a team, and my team's manager comes to me and says, "Tell me which of my docs are used by our users the most." Right. Now, after some probing and trying to find out the reason for this question, it might turn out that the manager actually wants to use the data to restructure the landing pages for a particular product, the documentation landing pages. So the real problem statement or goal is which of my docs or topics should I surface more prominently on my landing pages, right? Not really which of my docs are already the most popular. So based on the problem statement that we've figured out now, it's clear that the manager actually needs more data than just a list of the popular docs. The manager might also need information about how users enter our site, where they come from, how they navigate the docs, and so on. And also data about the time they spent on each page and bounce rate. So it's not just the page views that matter for this problem. And then there are other non-analytics factors that the manager should consider when designing the landing pages, right? So, such as, for example, the use cases that the product management team thinks are strategically the most important for the company, which we want to showcase on our landing page. So we should, again, remind ourselves constantly to not ignore those factors, which might actually turn out to be more important in the end than just the web analytics numbers. So that's the first part of the answer, which is start with the business problem. And the second thing is usually the budget. It's usually the best strategy for analytics is also the most expensive, right? So invariably in a business enterprise, when you set out to, on a web analytics project, you need to get approvals for staffing and budget to spend time getting the data, analyzing it, and reporting it, and so on. Sometimes you hire external consultants to do some of the work for you. So all that is expensive, right? So the answer might be that you don't have a lot of time or a lot of money to do this analytics exercise, which means, like I said in my session, in my talk, we need to be prepared in the analytics process, to invest considerable time and patience to get meaningful insights using analytics data. If we are not prepared to invest money, then I don't think analytics is a good data point to spend a lot of time on, right? So that's the second thing, the business problem, and then the budget. I don't know if that addressed the question that the person who asked it was had in mind, but I hope that added some more flavor.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. I think just figuring out how to just think about how to address the problem, how to break it down into smaller chunks. I think that's great. And Swapnil just popped in, even though it's probably the middle of the night for him. He said yes, so thank you. I thought Lana came up with a really great question too. How does the document type or genre correlate with the analysis strategy that you would apply to it? For example, is a strategy different for reference or how-to or tutorial topics?
Absolutely. I think we touched upon this a little bit in one of our slides in the talk, where we talked about how the time spent on page and the bounce rate could be extremely different for conceptual documentation versus step-by-step instructions. So the strategy would be the same, right? You would start with the business problem, but what the inferences you make would, I think, differ depending on the content type that you're actually analyzing. So I would expand the list that this person presented to not just reference how-to and tutorials, but also landing pages and conceptual content and so on, also marketing type content. And these days, there's a lot of kind of overlap between marketing and techno marketing kind of content in our documentation, right? So we need to be aware of that as well. So I would say that the key thing is to not start with a set notion that X number of page views or X bounce rate or X time spent is a good metric, right? Be prepared to kind of to wear an explorative hat and not so much try to prove that you're trying to justify an investment or so basically don't start with a set notion that I've been doing something and I want to prove using numbers that something is the right strategy, right? Or I want to propose a big change to my documentation site and I want to use metrics to support that proposal, right? That I think is kind of a self-defeatist kind of an approach, because there's always going to be someone out there who's going to look at the same numbers that you looked at with a very different view, right? They're going to have a different perspective on numbers. And we also how correlation can be misrepresented and used to our advantage or against us in many cases. So I think the strategy would be to, the broad strategy across document types would be to be prepared to go with an open mind and be prepared to get pushback when your numbers are being questioned. And also try to avoid making definitive statements about what would be a good metric for any of the measures that we talked about, page views and bounce rates and so on. As analysts, we're always going to be pushed into a corner to give an answer to those kinds of questions, right? Someone's going to come up and say, "Oh, our page views are stagnating. Is that a good thing, right?" Maybe it is, maybe it is not, right? So we should try to avoid giving a clear answer that might not consider the fact that the behavior of our customers is kind of not represented in the numbers, right?
It's like either you get a simple answer or you get the truth. You don't get both, right?
Exactly. If folks want just the straightforward analysis, then the numbers are going to tell a story. There, you don't need to say a lot. You can just graph it out and present the data. But if they're looking for insights, then I think we need more data than just the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's going to be a conversation all the time, analytics. It's not going to be an objective Q&A kind of a session when you go into an analytics discussion.
And oftentimes the
Long-winded
solutions aren't
answer, but I
simple
hope it
either.
helped.
Yeah. We just have a couple minutes left. Are there any other questions on your list that you really wanted to get to that you saw from the chat?
So there was one question. A few people asked a similar question, but I'd like to summarize that into one question, which is,
sure.
I think we talked about qualitative factors quite a lot in my session. And I was trying to emphasize that we need to use analytics data as supplementary input for decision making, and use other factors, qualitative factors like user feedback and user ratings. And some of the folks in the chat, I think they raised some good points about how user feedback also might not be fully indicative of what users really think about our content. I really don't know what the best strategy is for getting qualitative data. In my experience, the best strategy has been to sit down with the user face to face, or as a group of users that I'm observing, and then give them a task and see how they're performing on that task using our content. And some of us would call that focus groups, for example, right? And in the usability world. So those, I think, sessions I found to be the most useful, but I'm not sure whether they're representative, because you're just looking at one user or a group of users. And so scaling the insights that you get from such sessions and generalizing them to everything and to the entire population, I think is risky.
You have to be careful about your selection process too, right? So
Exactly.
you're not just selecting a really specific type of user in the first place.
Right. And if we expand our user base too much, then it's going to hit a budget constraint, and our organization is going to say that you run out of time or money to continue with this exercise. So I don't really have a good answer. The message I want to make here is that in any conversation about analytics, keep reminding the stakeholders and management that analytics are just one portion of the story. And remember the iceberg picture that I was showing in one of my slides. So you're just looking at the tip of the iceberg when you look at analytics, right? There's so much that's hidden that you just cannot unearth by using numbers.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Kumar. I think a lot of us feel like analytics are scary, and sometimes there's a lot of it's kind of nice. There's a lot of reassurance in finding that somebody who lives and breathes in the analytics world all the time finds it difficult to tease out the lessons too. So sometimes it's kind of nice when other people struggle with it, and to hear how you've dealt with those mysteries and how you found data that you find useful. It's just so helpful for the rest of us. I wanted to thank you again for coming in and sharing that knowledge with us, and sharing that, yeah, sometimes you don't have all the answers, but that's okay, right?
Yep, that's a good way to summarize the session. It's okay to not have answers, or okay to continue to be in an explorative mode.
Yeah. Well, thank you again. So with that, it's lunchtime for everybody. We get a break. Lightning talks. I don't think we've got... Oh, we've got a list in Slack. There we go. So Cynthia Harvey, Bart Bierman, the guy who basically makes the stage work, and we love him for it. Liana Inzalico, I apologize. I'm going to blame that on my Canadian accent if I got it wrong. Elisa Sawyer and Sarah Day, congratulations. You've been chosen, and keep your eyes peeled for a message from Rose. I'm so looking forward to your lightning talk. Over lunch, you can chat with other attendees. The hallways are open. Post pictures of your lunch with a hashtag, write the docs if you want to. Take a walk outside if the weather is good. And then Unconference is happening again in the afternoon after the lightning talks. So as usual, check out the schedule and join a session that you're interested in. And Jessica mentions that there's an Unconference to discuss qualitative data gathering and pairing with UX. So data gathering might be something that you're interested in if you're interested in Kumar's talk. So thank you again for attending. Thank you for your amazing questions. Sorry we couldn't get to them all. And thank you again, Kumar. Such a fun Q&A and so enlightening for us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, guys.
Have a good one.